place we just filmed your events on it.
Yep, so the voice going alright, Andy? Right here, okay? Cool. Can we get an official let's start, or is this? Go for it. Excellent. Hey, welcome everyone to my session, Information Architecture Decisions and Rainbows. Now I've been asked to spend most of my time on this half of the stage because I'm being filmed today, so g'day kids, stay in school. It doesn't mean I love this side of the audience any less, it's just apparently I look like Batman if I come too far over here and the light doesn't get me so well. So anyway, I will spend most of my time over here. Information Architecture Decisions and Rainbows. So what am I on about here today? Well, first of all, as is customary in these kind of events, I'll do a bit of an introduction, a bit about me and a bit about the topic. I'm going to talk about, in general, information architecture decisions, and then I'll talk in general about rainbows, just for a little while. And then by far the main bulk of the talk is this number 4 here, where I weave those two concepts together for you. I'm going to go through several examples of information architecture concepts, and once we've done that, I'll talk about how we put a lot of what we've talked about into practice. And then we'll summarise questions, and then you're free to go and eat lunch and all that sort of carry on. So, this is my 4th SharePoint conference, but it's the first time I've ever presented in Sydney, so I'm thrilled to be here today speaking to you folks. My name's Bryce Saunders, for those of you who don't know me. I'm a SharePoint consultant from Intergen in Dunedin in New Zealand. Hands up if you don't know where Dunedin is in New Zealand. Oh cool, okay, a bit of a geography lesson. So if this is the North Island and the South Island of New Zealand, Dunedin's right down there in the south of the South Island. Beautiful little town. I recommend you go and visit the place if you get a chance. I'm a Mad King runner, and I was a Mad King mountain biker until this happened. Now that's not actually me, but I don't have any footage of the actual accident. The next thing was this happened, and for those of you who've never been in that position, it causes you to think about some of the decisions that you've been making on your mountain bike. Yeah, I didn't give my wife all the details. So my boss had this to say, and my wife had this to say, and so consequently no more going over mountain bike jumps. I'm a father of 3, actually 3.5, probably more accurately about 3.6. We've got another one due in November, so you can appreciate that between putting a SharePoint conference talk together, having mountain bike accidents, raising children and going to work, I don't really have much time for sleep and all that carry on. And I love mangoes. I wanted 7 bullet points on my first slide, I could only think of 6, so, but I do love mangoes. So why I wanted to do this particular topic? Well, I often struggle to see things as clear cut. So every time I get a decision I've got to make, I can see, there's nothing kind of obvious to me, and there's a whole range of possibilities. And often I see other people quite comfortable with the solution, but I can still see a range of things. It's probably why I studied mathematics. It sort of gave me some solace that it was a reasonably exacting science. Not so SharePoint though. So what happens when you cast a mathematician into SharePoint? Well, you'll see. And I've got a general fascination with spectra, with a whole, anytime you come up with a concept in life, there's usually a continuum of possibilities along there. So I sort of thought about some of these examples. I'm mostly sane. I'm not very patient. I love eating, although I'm only a fairly average cook. And I'm particularly hopeless at drawing. You might be able to imagine where you might be yourselves on these and other spectra. So that's a little bit about introductions. Similar to life though, information architecture is not exact. Most of the questions we face ourselves with, in IT generally, but particularly in SharePoint, they don't have an exact answer. There's a whole range of possibilities. And things like, how should we divide this site up into site collections? Or should this be a separate content type, shouldn't it? And if you go into it thinking it is an exact science, if you go into a particular project and think you can reuse the same approach you took for the last project, or something you saw in a conference or a talk, then you're going to find yourself in a bit of difficulty because everything presents its own unique variables and its unique influences. So that leads to a very well or very overused phrase in the consultant's phrase book. It depends. So any one of you who is technical will have said this quite a lot and being berated for it by your salespeople and your project managers because they like to have exact answers to things. But if they persist on asking us ridiculous questions like, how long will it take you to turn this form here into a workflow? Or how much does a SharePoint intranet cost? Go on, give me a ballpark figure. And of course, it depends because there's so many possibilities. And we are also fairly difficult to get a straight answer out of. It's a lot like ordering on a menu. There's no right answer. There's just a better answer today because this is how hungry I happen to be today, or this is, I feel like a curry or a stir fry, or maybe I just want to try something new. Although like most decisions, there are some obvious wrong choices. Like, as a man, I definitely won't be having salad. No, actually this place, the salads are really good. Consultancy is a lot like predicting the weather. Okay, sometimes we're this guy here, we're out in the cold, woefully underprepared for the conditions. What looked like a nice day in the morning turned out to be quite not that. But sometimes we're so keen to avoid this situation that we overdo it. Okay? Wrap up far too warm and end up uncomfortable and having to carry blankets and jackets around for the day. So there's a fine balance to be prepared enough, but not to be so risk averse that we make all of our solutions and all of our decisions too complex. So there's a bit about architecture decisions. So I'll talk about rainbows now. You probably all feel reasonably familiar with rainbows. With decisions in life, I mentioned, they're not exact. There's usually a whole range of possibilities. And I think of them laid out on a spectrum, like a colour spectrum. And with SharePoint, I saw the same pattern emerging where you can usually lay things out as to how extreme they are in a particular direction. So I want to introduce a little device at the top of my screen here. I'm calling it Wavy. Wavy is going to represent a spectrum of ideas. Starts way down at one end of the spectrum here, goes right up to the other end of the spectrum. Pretty straightforward stuff. In the middle, we're going to have the good ideas. So if you think of all the ideas laid out on the spectrum, the good ones are in the middle. Now I've used the word good purposely because in this industry, far too often we get people saying, oh yeah, just do it with best practice. Just, you guys are the consultants, you guys should be doing best practice. And when we somehow get something wrong, well, you guys should have known better, you've got the best practice. And it's a myth. I've already mentioned that if you take a process from one customer to another or one project to another, you're going to get yourself in all sorts of difficulties because of all the variables involved. So to suggest as a best practice would suggest you've got this cause and effect type approach to things. Oh, well, I've got this problem, I'm going to solve it in this way. And it's clearly not the way that we roll with information architecture and IT in general. So we'll see this guy a lot from now on. So if you think of this at the top here as like the electromagnetic spectrum, whether if you know that from physics or if not, it goes basically from the radio waves at one end, the gamma rays at the other, and only the centre part is visible. The other colours you paint your house with. Okay, you might not paint your house red like this guy, or you might not paint it yellow or green, but you paint your house with visible colours, clearly. Because there's only folks who would appreciate it if you use colours from beyond that spectrum. Our friends the bees, who would get a kick out of it if you painted your house in ultraviolet. Snakes would get a kick out of it if you painted your house in infrared paint. And then there's nerds, who would just find it interesting if you used anything strange at all. So, coming back to this idea of the good ideas. Over the full range of electromagnetic spectrum, that's as technical as I get, sorry about that, only the centre part is visible light. And I want to balance that with the fact that over a full range of possible approaches you can take to your information architecture decisions, only some of them are viable. There's no right colour to paint your house, just as there's no best practice for these decisions. Just under certain circumstances, some things make more sense than others to implement. But I want to point out that as long as you get yourself on the rainbow, then you're okay. Still, some choices are better than others. It was a great fundraiser at the office, but I don't think pink's my colour. And importantly, make sure you commit to something. I've often told customers that I'd much rather implement the third best idea and be consistent across the whole solution, than some kind of awkward mixture between the two best ideas that becomes a difficult thing to interpret and to support. So commit to something. When you make a decision as a group, then go through with it. Makes your solutions a lot more able to be understood and handed over and things. So with that background, I'm going to go through, I think it's 7 concepts of information architecture now, and balance the extremes. Okay, so this section works by way of example of extremes. So each concept we're going to look at the effect of underdoing it. So when we think of all the possibilities laid out on a spectrum, I'll take you to one end of the spectrum and say, look, what if we just underdo it here? What if we don't even make any attempt at this? And then conversely, we'll head on up to the other end of the spectrum and see the same sort of problems we might get if we overdo it, and then using those as a balance, head back to the rainbow. Okay, so we use the extremes to help us appreciate why you wouldn't go to one end or the other, and that'll help channel our solutions. Okay. So one of the core concepts in information architecture is the content type. It sort of sits at the absolute middle of our information architecture, where they're the types of content we're working with. So what is it we've actually decided to embark on SharePoint for? What are we storing in here? What are we gathering together, and how are we going to work with it? And so an obvious extreme then to undercook this one completely would just be to not have content types. Let's not use them. And I hope you can all appreciate what, where you want to call out, hand up, what would be the problem with not having content types in your solution? Yes, in the front. Yeah, for sure. It's the thing with not using content types is, in fact, and this picture over on the right kind of suggests that you've actually got lots and lots of content types if you don't actually create any. What do I mean by that? Well, whether you realise it or not, or whether you like it or not, SharePoint has content types even when you don't use them. And so what you're actually doing is you're using, every document library uses the document content type, and every list uses the item content type. So if you just go and use your lists and libraries without putting proper content types in, what you're actually doing is having these slight variants of the document and item that are in fact not sharing any behaviour, they're not sharing any common elements, because you've had to go and create them in place in each of your lists and libraries. So you've kind of got a whole lot of ideas of content types without actually having a deliberate strategy. So hopefully we can see why that's probably not so helpful. But on the other hand, we can overdo this. And we can, when presented with something that's not quite exactly the same as something we've already got, one temptation is to think, oh, well, that should therefore be another content type. But we can overdo it, and I kind of try to illustrate that here with my classic MS Paint skills. But really, if you look at this, these are all the same thing with a slightly different background colour. It's kind of like a person with different hats on. And so you can really overdo it with content types if you can appreciate perhaps if you had a document called a compliance document, and another document called a regulatory document, and another one called a governance document. You really can't expect your users to know the difference between them. So you get ambiguity, you'll get inconsistent use, where you've got your users partially using one and partially using another, and no real consistency there. So how do we get this into the rainbow? Well, I put 3 questions in my own head and help educate my customers when they're thinking through this. There's 3 guiding criteria to work out whether something ought to be its own content type. The most obvious one is if there's a template document that you need to use. So every time you create a policy, if there's a policy header of particular fonts and colours and table structures that you use to author a policy, then that's a really good candidate. If it's going to have a template, it should be a content type on its own. Similarly, if you've got descriptive terms that you need to use to describe that type of content, for example, if I was storing a car, I'd probably be quite interested in its make, model, year, and a number plate. Whereas if I was storing boxes, then I want to know the dimensions of the box and how much it weighs. So they're quite different questions that I'm asking when I want to classify that piece of information. So they're really good candidates for a different content type. And the third one is behaviour. What do we want to have happen when somebody decides to store a document of that type? So when a policy turns up in the policy library, do I want to send an email? Do I want to generate some kind of workflow steps for review or approval or something, or perhaps I'm just grateful that they've stored it there and I don't want to do anything. But for any different type of behaviour, whether it be a workflow or some kind of records management, that's another really good candidate for another content type. Okay, but importantly, don't use the out-of-the-box SharePoint ones because they don't understand your business. They don't know what a policy means in your organisation. They don't know what procurement is in your organisation. They're just out-of-the-box content types, and they really don't add much more value than does storing stuff in the file system for that matter. So having established that we need a few content types, I want to talk about site columns next. And these, for those of you who aren't aware of site columns, these are the descriptive terms that we use to describe the content types. They're the properties or the fields, columns, whichever you want to call them. Now, if we don't use these, then really there's not a lot differing one content type for another because you've got nothing to describe what makes it different. Yes, you might have a different template document, but other than that, what are you really doing to determine what's different between, I don't know, a policy and a procedure or different types of content throughout your organisation? And perhaps then if you do have descriptive terms, maybe you're incorrectly adding the columns to the library, which takes us back to that previous discussion about content types. But the problem with doing this is you're missing an opportunity to reuse your terms. So for example, you might have a list of departments in one of your content types. You need to select which department it pertains to. But on the other hand, I've realised that I need a list of business units. And I kind of mean what you mean by departments, but because we didn't do it as a site column, which is a centralised notion of that property, we're missing out on the opportunity to have consistency and reuse between your notion of a business unit and my notion of a department. But we can easily overdo this as well. So we can get on the bandwagon and think, yes, okay, so we need to have site columns to describe our content types. We need to have all these descriptive terms. There's a couple of ways we can overdo this. We can either, every time we come across every single field and every single content type, we make it a whole different column. And then we can end up with 18 different ways of describing what's really just a free text string. Okay, the other way we can overdo it is by asking too many questions, putting too many properties against our content types. So I've got a photo of the census form here as an example. I think with SharePoint, there's been some really good discussions here at this conference and some good talks on it about the notion of adoption. I think we struggle enough with SharePoint to get good adoption through our businesses, and I certainly see a lot of customers with that issue. I think sometimes we should just be grateful as information architecture solution leads that our users have opted to use our system to store their documents and not overdo it by asking loads and loads of questions that really don't add any value to storage itself. So, if we ask 15 questions, if we want to fill out 15 fields every time someone uploads a document, they're soon going to want to go back to the old way of putting it on the C drive or their desktop or file share because they didn't get asked all these pesky questions back then. So it's a balancing act. So how do I get that into the rainbow? Similar to the content types, I ask a few quick questions in my own head and help my customers go through this. Now, the third point I have up there, actually the most important one, is it compulsory? Because if it's a compulsory piece of information, then we don't need to take that argument any further. If there's no point putting a policy in this library unless there's an owner, then that's got to be a site column, that's got to be a field, because we don't want to go having things stored that don't have compulsory information against them. So that's clean. But once you get outside the compulsory fields, you have to ask yourself, are we actually going to use this field, or are we just annoying our users by asking a whole lot of questions and they're just going to go tab, 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 or use the default values and not really add the value you thought you were adding anyway? So I think there's a sensible maximum number of questions you want to ask. I mean, sometimes you have a census to fill out and yeah, there'll be lots of questions, but most of the time, if it's a document that was otherwise just sitting on the file share, well, it's a huge step to have proper document management. Let's not turn people away by asking too many questions. So having established, hopefully, a good set of content types and descriptive terms for those content types, we have this notion of a content type hub, which is kind of like a newspaper distribution network. It's a way of saying, well, we don't really want to have to deploy our content types all over our site. We've got lots of things called site collections, which I'm going to talk about soon, that don't actually have the same content types as one another, but we have a mechanism for keeping them all in line, and it's called the content type hub. One extreme, if we're looking at this as an extreme example, is that we don't have to use the content type hub. So the obvious extreme is let's not. Now if you do this, what it means is if you have multiple site collections in your SharePoint farm, you're going to have a way of getting all the content types that you need to go to all of those site collections. So it needs its own information architecture. And every time something changes, then you're going to have to go and make those changes to all of the places that you've deployed those those content types to. That's okay, people will do it this way, and that's perfectly reasonable. You just need to know that that's the choice you're making. If you don't use the content type hub, you've got to go and deploy your information architecture building blocks everywhere. But, like everything in this talk, you can overdo this concept as well. So if we decide that, okay, well we don't want to have to go and deploy all our content types to all our different areas of our site, so instead let's put everything in the hub so that if we need anything, then it's available to us everywhere. That sounds kind of useful, but the problem is exactly that. Everything is then available everywhere. So you might have created a particular content type because down in your finance area of your business there was a need for a particular type of forecasting spreadsheet. So you create a forecasting spreadsheet content type, put it into the hub, and suddenly down in HR, they've now got this forecasting spreadsheet content type which kind of doesn't have any relevance to them. And when they go to, so if people are building lists and libraries and trying to work out what content types they need to support, there's an enormous range of irrelevant types that really there's no point having there. The other thing is the content type hub, for those of you who have used it or deployed it, there are some caveats, shall we say. There are things that don't work that well because when you publish these things out to various places, they try to make reference to something in their local site, for example a template document or a workflow association, but the hub doesn't replicate those things. The hub only replicates the content types themselves. So, to quote that, it can be a bit of a hassle for people who are a little bit mixed on their opinions of the content type hub. Which is why, for the getting it into the rainbow side of things, I want to have a vote. Because I went to the Melbourne and Auckland SharePoint conferences last year, and I spoke to quite a few people, as SharePoint nerds will. They'll talk about content type hubs and site collections and things. And I'm interested, just to get a show of hands here, let's have a vote if you, obviously I can't tell you the results of the New Zealand conference because that's next week, but I want you to put your hand up if you do use, or you think you would use, the content type hub. Nice and high. Cool, so doing a quick count about at 5,000, that's about 50 people, methinks. What if you, on the other hand, don't use the hub, or you wouldn't use it if given the choice? Yep, so I'm guessing we've got 10 or so of you there. And, don't be shy. If you put your hand up if you think, what on earth is the content type hub? I have no idea what we're on about. Excellent. Okay, so there's a few of you there. It'll hopefully be a little clearer after the next few slides. So the content type hub is an opportunity to roll out the same information architecture across many different parts of the site. But you've just seen, whilst there's potential problems with not using it at all, there are as many problems with overdoing it as well. So what I try to do is I try to consider, and I use my customers as well to determine this, what is truly global? What are the types of information that we're working with that everyone would agree are kind of core to the business? What is it that we're going to base most of our thinking on, and some of the things that if you went to HR or you went to finance or you went to operations or went to the production line, they'll all agree that we have this general notion of a personnel file, or we all have this notion of a policy or something like that. And so those are the kinds of things that make good candidates to go into the hub. But any of the specific stuff that I talk talked about the forecasting spreadsheet before, that example, or something that's really particular to a part of the business, doesn't belong in the hub, in my opinion. So I try to draw a line between things I consider to be truly global and things that are niche to a particular area. Something to bear in mind though, it's not like a live feed, this hub. It's more like a newspaper distribution where the newspaper gets written, printed, it goes onto the trucks, and then they throw them over your fence and try and smash your letterbox with them, and they arrive on your house. It's quite a different concept to then recall all those newspapers, okay? So there's no obvious way or no easy way to go around all those houses and retrieve all of those newspapers. And similar in the hub, once something's been deployed using the content type hub, it is where it is. You can unpublish to sort of retract, but it doesn't remove the content type from the places you put it. So there is quite a lot of deliberate strategy that you need to have when you're considering this kind of thing. And there's a couple of other points there too about if you accidentally deploy things where you don't want them, there is a bit of a painful clean-up job associated with that. One example I always make sure I do is when you set up the content type hub, it's set up to replicate everywhere in your SharePoint farm. It'll go out to every My Site, for example. You guys know what I mean by My Site in SharePoint? It's like your own team site for you, if you like. So if you don't want all of your organisational content types going out to every single My Site in your whole implementation, it's really important to disable the timer job that will otherwise do that for you. Because again, cleanup sucks when it comes to taking content types out of sites. So I've talked a bit about site collections, and I debated whether to put this section before the hub one or after. I ended up going with after, but I might have left you a bit confused as to what I meant by site collections, so hopefully that will clear up in this next piece. The obvious extreme for site collections might be don't have them, but if considering a site collection is the very container that your site lives in, we don't really want to go to that extreme, or you just wouldn't be using SharePoint at all. So let's decide our extreme in this case is to have one site collection for everything. So this photo of a crowd over here suggests that we might have a bit of a crowded situation, but there's one key issue, main issue, that strikes me as why you wouldn't use a single site collection for your whole site. Someone want to put their hand up and suggest what that is? Yes? Absolutely right. Yep, that's my first point in here. A site collection resides in a single content database. That's a SQL Server database, and if you put a single site collection in, you have decided, therefore, to have one database looking after all of your content. And depending on who you talk to, what posts you read, and there's a bit of confusing stuff out there on the net, 200 gigabytes is the suggested threshold for how large a content database ought to be. So unless you've got a small implementation that has no delusions of grandeur and will never get anywhere near that, then you've really got to start getting off the ground and not having a single content database. Other potential problems with doing that is you've no opportunity with a single site collection to delegate out site collection administration. It's the top level of administration that we have, and it's a bit of an IT function. But with one site collection, you're forcing a single group to do that, which means if you've got lots of different business critical things in your site collection, you're going to either be forced to have lots of site collection administrators. It's quite a large, risky group because they've got to independently know and own the whole area. Or you've got an exclusive group of people trying to do it on behalf of everybody, and that can get busy for those folk. But like everything else, we can really overdo this as well. And I take you back to that slide before with the guy out in the rain in his t-shirt versus the guy who was wrapped up in too many blankets by the fire. Trying to avoid this issue of having a single site collection and getting a content database up towards the threshold, I've seen a lot of people overdo that by every time someone comes along with a new request of any kind of information, their knee-jerk reaction is new site collection, new content database. Okay, now there are times when that is absolutely the right decision, but you can really overdo this. And I often say that I've got kids of my own, and any one of you that have got kids will probably agree that Kids, they get along sometimes, but they don't share particularly well, particularly if it's one person's birthday and they've got a new toy. No, good luck getting the other kids to have a turn with that for a while. Similarly, site collections, they're part of the Big Happy family, they're all part of the same web application, but they don't share a lot of their notions either. So they don't share their metadata, they don't share the types of content that they're there to work with, and we saw that example when I talked about the content type hub. The hub is there to avoid the problem you get because the different site collections don't share their structure. Similarly, they don't share navigation because they're trying to be quite independent. They're trying to be their own area of the site, but we would like them to all be part of the same user experience, so we need some way of having them share their navigation. And they don't share other things like security. So if I set people up to be an administrator or a contributor to one site collection, I've got to then do that again for the other site collections because they don't have this shared notion of security. Similarly, if I have some strange back corner feature that I need to enable because the finance team need to do some kind of BI function or something, then that hasn't shared. I've enabled this feature in one place, but I haven't been able to enable it in all places unless I visit every single site collection. So anything that I want to be consistent with, anything that I want to have navigation or security or settings, then I've either got to go and visit every single site collection and do it manually, or I've got to have some kind of script or a feature to deploy that will actually affect those settings. So this one is probably the hardest concept to get right. So how do I get this into the rainbow? Well, we can hopefully all agree that decision to put everything in one site collection has its obvious pitfalls. Just one content database means that you've got this upper limit to how big your site can ever get. We've got problems with security and management of that. But on the other hand, we've just seen too many site collections. There's too many places to visit or too many things to keep track of. So we all kind of agree, well, let's divvy this thing up into some manageable chunks, but the hardest thing is how to do that. And we can use things like the likely scale of our sites to help appreciate when we're going to need to go into multiple site collections. But really, this is one of the examples where the consultant shouldn't try and be too clever and disappear off and come up with a strategy on their own. This is a job for user experience designers, information architects, and the business users to get together and work out a useful, try to crystal ball gaze a little bit and say, okay, so you've asked me for a place to put contracts or legal documents or HR things. So how many of them do you have, and how many of them do you think you're going to have going into the future? And try to do some capacity planning around it. Nonetheless, you will probably agree that having multiple site connections is probably a good idea. So you do need some kind of strategy to keep sharing their metadata and their content types and their security and all those things. So some kind of script that you use or some kind of deployed features to do that. So having established a site structure, site collections and your metadata, your content types and site columns, it's now time to think about the actual places to put things. We've got these big site areas now, and we've got the types of information that we want to work with. So now it's time to actually think about storing them and giving the users places to put their stuff. So one extreme, when we're looking at lists and libraries, is let's just put one library in the site and use it to store everything. That's certainly the decision that my family has made with this drawer in our kitchen. Just open it, put it in. The trouble with that is, what are you really asking this drawer to do, or what are you asking this library to do? If you've done your content types right, and your columns, you're asking this poor old library to have support for so many content types, and then every column of every content type. So it's getting pretty cluttered. And if at some stage you want to look at only the blue things, or only the pointy things, then you're going to have to write lots of views and lots of different ways of slicing at that information to get out what you want. An added complexity here is one of my clever kids decided to spill an entire container of drawing pins into the drawer. So it's not only a painful user experience, it's actually just a painful experience. You come out with little pins on your fingers looking for batteries, not so cool. The other thing too is if you've seen a document library or a list where someone's allocated too many content types and you upload a document, so I'll just put a document in here because I was told to, and then it'll say, thank you for storing your document here, which content type was it? And then there's a drop-down list that goes off the page. Or if you've got the create new screen, so I like to create a new, whoa, hang on, and it's just too confusing for the user. So you really want to think about how many things you put together there. But we can overdo this too. So this photo comes from one of those funky candy stores they have in the States, where they, the Americans aren't content to buy a bag of M&Ms, they want to buy a bag of pink M&Ms or a bag of yellow M&Ms. But, obviously you can get into a situation if you've got too many lists in libraries where really they're pretty much the same thing. And if someone comes in and wants a bag of multicoloured M&Ms, you've now got to go to 8 libraries to get that. You've got to go to 8 containers to service that request. Unless you're really observant, you notice that bottom one there seems to be multicoloured. But the logic that applies to this sort of setup where you've got lots of libraries whose function is very similar. You get a situation where you've got that library logic repeated. You might end up putting the same content type in every single library, or very similar content types in every single library, and you'll get subtle differences. People are thinking, oh, do I need to use the legal library for that, or is that more of governance? Or should that be HR, or is it more personnel? And you get these ambiguous choices again. Something I'm often saying to my customers is it's easier, although not going back to the extreme of my drawer in my kitchen, it's easier to put several things together and then use views to separate them, because views are really interactive in SharePoint and you can order and group them and do lots of stuff with those. It's easier to do that than it is to store things separately and then try and create a view that brings them together. Because to bring things together that are not stored together requires you to use search or a content query, and that's perfectly capable, but the display and the interaction is not as easy to create with the search results or a content query as it is with the built-in list views, which are really quite easy for end users to create and configure for themselves. So, how do I get this one into the rainbow? Well, when a concept comes out, whether it be SharePoint concept or a general concept in life, I pay a bit of attention to what the person who came up with it decided to call it. So libraries are a classic example. Why did someone create document libraries and decide to call them document libraries? And so I like to put a parallel to real libraries, because we all know what real libraries are. And in particular, do you guys in Australia, do you have toy libraries? Those with kids? Yep. So a toy library, if you've got kids, you buy them these toys and they love you for it. They play with them for about 2 weeks, and then the novelty wears off, and the toy goes into the cupboard, never to be seen again until the next kid reaches that age, and then it comes out of the cupboard for 2 more weeks, and then goes back in again. So toy libraries, you get to get a toy for a couple of weeks, and just as the novelty wears off, you throw it back in your car and go and get another one for $2 for another 2 weeks. Why I've told you all of this is that there are skills that are required by someone to be a good toy librarian. Okay, they need to understand what's the latest toys that the 2-year-olds are playing with. They need to be able to issue a big plastic slide to a parent whose kid has decided to climb up the gym equipment and fall over and hurt themselves. So there's quite a lot of different skills there, for example, than what would make a good city librarian who needs to understand reference materials and needs to be able to troubleshoot internet connections and access newspaper archives and things like that. So there's lots of different skills, and those libraries have got a lot of different facilities. So I think then back to the SharePoint document libraries, and I think, well, if this library has the same people that would look after it as this other library, and the same kinds of information and the same types of ways of working with that information, am I not possibly looking at a good candidate to not have 2 separate libraries and actually just use one? On the other hand, if I'm putting stuff into a library and it's quite different from who would access it or who would delegate access to it, or the kinds of behaviour that those items would undergo once they arrive, then I'm probably trying too hard to put things into a library together, and perhaps I should look at separating them. Similarly, it's, whilst you can get many things in your public library, toys isn't one of them usually, because you don't have a wide open space to lay the toys out, and you don't really want kids running around trying out slides when other people are trying to read. So it's about just thinking about the intent of the library and what people are going to put it to. So we're nearly there now, guys. Oh yes, I've thrown this in because more libraries means more librarians. I married one of those, you might remember her from earlier. Finish on a couple of, I think there's 2 to go. This one could be controversial, you'll have varying opinions on this. Within our libraries, we can have folders. One extreme is, let's not use them. Let's not have folders in our libraries. And a lot of you might be thinking, that's not an extreme, that's just a rule. We don't want to use folders. And I don't disagree entirely, but obviously an extreme would be to not use them. If you don't use folders though, then, and this will be controversial for some of you as well, but if you don't use folders, then when you have differing needs for access by differing types of people, you've only got 2 choices. You can create new libraries to put the different content in, or you can go even further and create different sites, and different site collections even. But if you don't want to go to different libraries, then you have to use item level permissions on the items, and neither of those are a particularly good place to be, particularly if you've got a few different combinations of use. Now, I don't encourage you to overdo the who has access to what, and I often talk to customers about this. On your file shares, you know, the K drive or the R drive or whatever you call it, most people generally have access to most things, what I tend to find. So then people try to get all clever about it when they go to SharePoint. Oh, we'll have this rigid security structure that'll be just everything we've always wanted. The reality is, don't do that. Keep it to a manageable, simple set of access to things. But if you must have a few discrete groups of permissions, then folders is an option, and it's one of the only options I look at with folders. The other one, and I was convinced of this by a customer recently, if the structure of the folders is genuinely the way everybody sees it, the way everybody wants to classify that information, then you could go out to that number of libraries, or you could use folders. And I got a customer that has 18 folders in every project that they do. And they have different security to each of those folders. And they have, every project works exactly the same. Now I could have created 18 document libraries, but because the behaviour in those libraries, the workflows associated were very similar between each of the 18 groups of documents, we went through a pro and con process, and actually the folders went through, and it's not where I thought we would end up, but I just wanted to be open-minded about it, and it can be useful if it is the way everybody sees it. But clearly we can overdo the folders. Okay, we see this in Windows Explorer all the time, nested folders. If you create that same problem by importing a vast swathe of file share folders straight into SharePoint, you're just going to inherit all those same problems. Okay, you'll have a slightly better search and you'll have document management, so it's a bit of a bonus, but you're not going to have any nice way of navigating your files. It's one person's idea of a structure. Okay, so if I want to see something based on region and you want to see something based on date, and someone else wants to see something based on the owner of the information, folders don't really support that. But and by using folders, we're eroding one of the biggest powers of SharePoint, which is its metadata structure, its classifications, to be able to say that business unit, that user, that time period, and that amount. And then we can use views and search to really refine down onto those categories. But as soon as you use folders, you've just put things in big locked up boxes, and your opportunity for appreciating that from another perspective is diminished. So basically what I would imagine, or how I imagine this, is every candidate that you get where you are quite keen to create a folder in SharePoint, stop and think about why, and try not to. If you want to know some really good examples of why folders are bad or evil, just Google why folders are bad or why folders are evil. There are many blog posts on that. So getting this one into the rainbow, I've said most of this one already, but I only really support using folders in libraries if there's a clear case for managing permissions where otherwise it would relate in too many libraries or the need for item level permissions. And as I said recently, I've been convinced by a customer where the way everybody sees it was another good candidate candidate for using folders. But if I leave you on one point on this slide, but it really just applies to most of what I've been saying, is be deliberate about it. Don't just say, oh, we need a few things to be over here, we'll just create a folder, or we'll just create another library for this. Sit back and think why, and what are going to be the pros and cons of doing that. And really just a brief mention of document sets here. I don't know how many of you will have used or know about document sets, but they're like folders in many respects, but are not confined to just having a name and a place to go and put things. They're actually a content type in their own right, and as a result they have properties and you can associate workflows and all that sort of thing. So most of the time when you're considering using folders, either don't use them or consider the use of document sets instead, because there's many advantages of doing that. There are limitations though, they're not interchangeable, document sets and folders, but happy to talk afterwards if anyone wants to go into any detail on those. So the last one is global navigation. So we talked about how site collections, they don't share navigation, they each try to be independent of one another. And so the extreme here is that we just let SharePoint go, let just SharePoint do its own navigation, or worse, because we know the site collections won't share the navigation, let's just do a single site collection. But we hopefully can remember the earlier slide where putting everything in one site collection has worse issues than that. So either of those really aren't global navigation at all. Overdoing it is the kind of the realisation that you do then have to deploy navigation separately to every site collection. Who recognises, you probably can't read that from there, but who waited for managed metadata navigation in SharePoint 2013 and went, awesome, I'm now going to be able to have a global navigation driven from our managed metadata service? Yep, a few hands there. And then who did what I did and set up a site collection and hooked it up to managed metadata and it all worked nicely and you went, awesome, and then went to the next site collection and said, right, I'll just use that same navigation, and then got that, which basically says, yeah, you can't do that, you can only use that area once. Just thought, well, hang on, isn't this what we've actually been excited about? So whether you do it that way or some other way, you pretty much have to go to every site collection and do something specific to that site collection regarding navigation. And the other things too is there's a few different ways you can use managed metadata to do navigation. You can use the navigation area of site settings, and you can use that new 2013 edit links that you might see in the top navigation or on the site. Either way though, some of those aren't available depending on what site template that you're in, or they might not be available depending on what features you have enabled. You can see blog posts out there, people saying, where's my edit links button gone, or I can't see the navigation settings. So what we do at Intergen to solve that problem is we make use of the fact that SharePoint's all about lists. So we create a list whose job is to have the global navigation. It's a single list that sits in a site on its own, and using a feature we put a control into our master page so that it immediately shows up everywhere. And so this list leads to the top level navigation. And if you want to make changes to it, those who have the rights to contribute to the list can make changes to the global navigation. It's as simple as that. Though that takes the problem away from how you get the same navigation out to all of your site collections, but it brings a larger problem along to what should actually be in your global navigation, because that's a key usability feature. If you've got the wrong top level navigation, it's the window into your site. It's the way users come along and they'll head straight for that top level navigation to try and understand it. And if they can't immediately see from there or some obvious visual cues on the page how to get where they're going, you've probably not got the right top level navigation. So by far the bigger problem, rather than how to get the same navigation everywhere, is to design what is a candidate for that top level of interaction with people. And again, it's the whole case of don't be the consultant or the project lead who thinks they have to come up with this and then spring it upon unsuspecting users. This is a case for getting the users and engaging with them. And I went to a great session of Octavia's last night where she talked about the number of people she sat with to actually elicit that information and watch how people work. So SharePoint consultants aren't too good at working out what the top level navigation should be. users are much better at driving that information gathering. So pat yourselves on the back, folks. That was a tour de force of a section, that one. We're just about there. There are a lot of things that influence our solution, so it's not always just a pure case of decision making. Scale, we've already seen. If we think we're going to have the case for lots of information, then that drives our decision on how many site collections that we think we might want. If we've got particular template documents, then that drives the need for, as we saw earlier, content types in order to house those template documents. So some of these things they help themselves. You don't have to come up with these things from scratch. Other times there's just preferences. I mentioned that I had a customer that really just had a preference to use folders in a particular document library. I, as a consultant, might prefer to use or not use the content type hub, as we talked about earlier. So there's a whole lot of these different influences. And they provide focus to our solutions. So sometimes you might have a spectrum of ideas, but you can eliminate some because, well, that one's not available because we're not using Enterprise Edition. Or of these two possibilities, this one's not going to be able to be delivered by August when we need to be going live. And there's lots of different influences there that allow us to focus on a solution. So I actually like constraints. I don't feel constrained by them. I actually find that they're a helpful way of getting a vast array of possibilities, often with very little way of distinguishing whether this is better than that or what the pros and cons are. And if you think of why everyone likes MacGyver, if he had this series of items here and had to escape from a locked up prison somewhere in the mountains, he'd be fine. He'd go, I can make a rope, I can build an aircraft, yep, I'll be fine, okay? So this is when we're constrained, when we have some of our opportunities taken away, that's when it drives the best innovation. So someone will say, you need to create this, and you think, right, that's what I'm going to do, and then they say, oh, by the way, you can't use this, or we're not going to have Enterprise Edition, or whatever it might be, and you're constraining. One example, and this has been something I've been working on a bit lately, who's built InfoPath forms with SharePoint Designer Workflow? Yeah, I liken building InfoPath forms with SharePoint Designer Workflow to driving a car down the street, using the parked cars on either side of the road, smashing into them along the way in order to get down the street. And when you get up the other end of the street, you look back at all the broken cars and realise there was really only one way to drive down that street, but it took you all that broken cars to realise it. But you start building, you go, oh yeah, okay, I can't use that field type, and yeah, that workflow's not going to, and back and forth, and I find you don't get any better at that. But the constraints, they do channel your path somewhat. So how do we put this into practice? So I've given you plenty of examples here of extremes that are not particularly viable, hopefully helping you organise some of the viable ideas between them. But I think the key point I want to make is don't try to be too clever. Don't try so hard to avoid being the guy out in the rain in a t-shirt that you make all of your solutions complex, because a lot of the concepts that you'll be bringing forth to try and implement these complex solutions, people aren't going to understand them. And they're not going to adopt things well that are too complex. Aeroplanes are fantastic because they're really complicated machines. But the users, the passengers, they just sit in their seat, tighten their seatbelt and wait for the line to get delivered. The pilots are the clever ones that need to understand what all the dials mean. And if we try and be too clever in SharePoint, we're going to end up expecting all of our users to be the pilots. And in fact, they just want a place to put things, to store their information. When, as a consultant, you are actually training even when you are consulting. So, as opposed to, when I do requirements gathering, I don't consider it requirements gathering. I consider that I'm actually educating the users or educating the customer, because they don't know what a content type is. You can't use words like metadata and site collection and content type hub. You've just got to talk to them about the work they do and understand what it is that they're actually doing. And like this point here, the cold light of day shines on some of our decisions and makes fools out of all of us. So we all go into it and we think, okay, this seems like a viable approach. And then when the content rolls in, we go, oh, okay, that should have been 2 site collections. Or, yes, we really ought to have put more content types here. So 85% is about a line I like to draw and say, that's about how correct we're going to be. We're going to make some mistakes. We're going to be exposed in a few areas. The only way to attack that is to involve more people in the decision-making process. So you're not just the consultant who didn't obey best practice and didn't end up with enough content time, so you created too many libraries and people are finding it confusing. Sit down with your customers or your teams and agree that if we were to go this way, we'll solve this problem and this problem, but we are going to have some trade-offs to make. We are going to have some disadvantages by using folders here or by using too many libraries there. On the other hand, if we do this alternative approach, we won't have those problems, but we'll create these. And if we all agree to the cons and in favour of the pros in that scenario, then we've at least got an ability to handle it when those pros present themselves. We can say, yes, we did foresee this, and here's our strategy for it. I think importantly though, when you do come up with a consensus for how you're going to construct your solutions, write down not just the decisions you made, but the decisions that you turned down. Because otherwise, it's similar to commenting your code, otherwise someone else is going to come along and see you standing there in the rain in your t-shirt and say, why didn't he just do this? Or why didn't he take this approach? And if you've got it documented, we had 3 options. We chose option B because A had this problem and B had these problems. Then it's a bit easier to provide some traceability in your decision making. Otherwise, you can just look silly and the hindsight's a wonderful thing. Maybe you should have taken option A. Maybe no one can deny that that was the poor decision to go with B. But at least if you've considered it beforehand, there's an element of traceability as a group. So, a summary. Life is full of decisions, and they usually lay themselves out on a big old spectrum. Usually, there's some obvious poor decisions, and within which hopefully there's some useful ones. And I think SharePoint information architecture is no different. You've seen those 7 examples that I gave earlier. The trick though, life or with SharePoint, is to get on the rainbow. But don't expect to get it right every time. Do it with balanced, open-minded dialogue with all of the stakeholders and all the people involved. Because then, you've got a much better chance of getting it right than just you as an individual solution designer or a consultant trying to do it on your own. But you will get it wrong sometimes. So if you're going to get it right 85% of the time, you're going to get it wrong 15% of the time. And that's what consultancy is all about. It's not about perfect solutions, it's about consulting. And if you do it right, once in a while, if you get it right, your life will be full of rainbows. So you are free to go, or if you want to ask any questions, I'll be up here for a while unpacking some things, and then I'll be heading into the speaker's corner. And I see my swag-carrying colleague down there is waving some things around. I've got a couple of things up here to give away if people want to ask questions, but otherwise, yeah, thank you very much for coming.